My name is Maxi Schoeman. I'm a professor of international relations at the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. I became interested in issues surrounding the Horn of Africa about 4 or 5 years ago when I was first invited to attend one of the CIRC conferences here in Lund. This time around, given the theme of the conference this year, where particular attention was going to be paid to the role of faith and religion in finding peaceful resolutions, two things struck me immediately. The first one was that people very often look towards the South African case of peaceful negotiations for a solution. And the second aspect that struck me very much was the extent to which, through international involvement in Somalia, especially the United States involvement, it seemed to me that what was lacking at a very fundamental level was an understanding of the different ways that these two communities, if you want, the one being the United States government, the other one the Somali people, the very different conceptions that they have of peace, and the fact that very few people know that there are these differences, and therefore there is no sense of trying to talk to each other across these differences. In the case of the South African peace negotiation, I think that sometimes we overstate it to the extent that we use only this one example of peaceful resolution of conflict in Africa. We forget that in the case of Mozambique, a civil war lasting 16 years, it was a Roman Catholic, small Roman Catholic community that came to the rescue. In other words, worked with the people from the grassroots level right up to the international community, trying to bring people together and to get them to sign eventually a peace agreement. So for the whole 16 years, the community of Dhacdo stayed with the civil war in Mozambique and helped to make peace. And for me, that was important. I wanted to see what was it that they did, because people also do not necessarily know that there is a very strong Islamic presence in Mozambique, especially in the northern part of the country. And what Dhacdo managed to do was to bring both Christian and Muslim communities together to talk about peace. But it was not only at the local level, it was also at the international level. They, in the end, negotiated, or not negotiated, mediated and facilitated negotiations with all the parties included, not only local, not only cultural and religious or the warring parties, but also the advisors from the United States, the United Nations as one of the actors in the peace process itself. And what struck me about them was this ability that they had, because they were so committed to their religion, their ability to talk across divisions, also religious divisions, and to bring everyone in. And the other thing was that they did not only talk, they also helped the poor and the marginalized in that civil war devastated country by giving everyone, both Muslim and Christian, access to their education networks. They helped them with food and shelter. They organized for large shipments of food and medicine to be brought into the country at times when things were really going very bad. I said to myself, you know, maybe this is the difference if we look at Somalia. We do not have a faith-based community who is involved and who is trying to promote understanding between the different protagonists, if you want. And on the part of the United States, I sometimes think to myself, for them, their view of Islam seems to me, at least, to be very much one of a very narrow definition of what Islam is all about. It is a focus on it as a violent religion, as a religion that promotes terrorism. And this is, of course, not necessarily true. And it's not the only religion from which we have seen terrorism develop, or terrorist acts being justified in terms of the religion. And it is as if there's a lack of seeing Muslim people as being representative of a whole spectrum. Plus, what also feeds into this very narrow vision of Islam, I think, on the part of Christianity in general, is the fact that we tend, in terms of modernity, to look at peace very much as something that you have to create now. You have to stop the violence, you have to get past it. Doesn't matter what the cost is, let's just stop the violence and get to a peace agreement, and afterwards we can sort out the other problems. And it means that very often you do not take account of things such as justice, which is at the core, from my understanding of Islam, at the core also of peace. In Islam, my understanding is that you cannot separate peace and justice. From a Christian, or let's rather call it a Western perspective, because it's not all that much infused with Christian values necessarily. From a Western perspective, we tend to emphasize only peace, and we say once we have peace, we can start looking at issues of justice. What are the conditions necessary for what Islam calls human flourishing? But it is very difficult, very often, for people of the Islamic faith to live with that notion of peace. If justice is not incorporated right from the start, it is difficult for them to see this process as being legitimate. And at a practical level, it's important to, if I can move away completely from Islam, and just give you an example of the peace negotiations, or the negotiations in Zimbabwe. Why is that agreement not working at the moment? Because the parties in the agreement were told, just sign the agreement now to say that you will share power, and you can sort out the finer detail later. Now they've signed the agreement, now it turns out that they can't really make up their minds about how to implement that agreement. And I think for me that is the main problem in Somalia, and why I wanted to come here and talk about the possibility of using faith-based organizations, of using people who are committed to peace and justice to help to create understanding amongst the various parties to the conflict. And one might say that the United States is not a party to the conflict, but it does very greatly determine what is happening. And the international community broadly, if you look at the Djibouti process, it is promoted and facilitated largely by the international community. And if there's not this understanding that within an Islamic tradition we have to pay as much attention to justice as to peace, I cannot see that we are really going to be able to get to not a peaceful resolution, but to a resolution that one can implement on the ground, and that would be inclusive of everyone back in Somalia. You know, there's a new report that Ken Menkaus put out recently, in I think it was in September, and one should really look at that. What I found interesting about that report was that he mentions in there that the Union of Islamic Courts, for instance, several times invited the United States to come to Mogadishu and to come and see whether these so-called terrorists or terrorist suspects were actually there. And that was never taken up. And I think that was one of the sad things around what happened in Mogadishu, around the the Union of Islamic Courts, was the fact that no one tried to identify what their success was. What were the elements? They didn't try to disaggregate it, to see what was it that brought this element of security to people. What was it that made them feel more secure? What was it that made them feel that now they are beginning to see a new environment around them? We didn't try to do that. It was as if the international community was only trying to get rid of these courts without seeing what they could perhaps learn from them. I'm not saying that these courts were perfect. We know that there were certain statements made which really, I think, made a lot of people uncomfortable, maybe even some Somalis. But the fact of the matter is that they did manage, after more than a decade, to bring some sense of security. That's what people want in the first place. And how do they get that? It seems to me from a feeling of there is peace, and there is justice. And then something that you mentioned, which I think is very important, and justice is seen to be done. And we have now removed that again. I can't see any guarantee in the Djibouti process that we will anytime soon see justice to be done again. And for me, this is often the pity of the way in which the West and Islam, and perhaps the West and African traditional societies, how they tend to talk past each other, that there is no real understanding of what the basic values are. What are the things that are important to people? What are the mechanisms with which one can bring these important values to a society, and what can we learn from it? And that was perhaps the tragedy of the very short reign of the Union of Islamic Courts, was that they brought a semblance of peace, of justice, and of security to the community, but it was not allowed to flourish because a Western interpretation was put on it, and it was seen as being radical and dangerous. I'm not sure always dangerous to whom. And what has resulted from that? And in an even worse position today than we were when we were here a year ago at the other conference. And until such a time that we're going to be willing to talk to each other, never mind or despite our different views, whether we come from a Christian perspective, an Islamic perspective, a Western perspective, a Middle Eastern perspective, we're not going to be able to solve these problems within the Horn of Africa and also in other contexts in Africa. But it is obviously one of the causes of the current destruction that is going on. It is, even if it's just at the level of a lack of understanding of who should be at the peace negotiations and to what extent they should be free to come in with an own agenda. In that sense, I think the Somali conflict is very tragic, because what we are doing at the moment, it seems to me, is to perpetuate a mutual lack of understanding. There's some kind of a decision of where we want to get to. We want peace for Somali, but it has to be a very specific peace which has not necessarily been decided on by the Somali people, and now we want to rush it to get to that point without taking into account this very, very crucial link within Islam between peace and justice. We can't have, we want peace first and then try and sort out the justice aspect. And if you really want to respect people who come from an Islamic background and tradition, you will realize that you cannot have peace unless justice is absolutely inherently linked to the whole issue of peace.
Great